Human populations have a habit of growing and growing and growing. Even since the ancient Greco-Roman period, overpopulation was acknowledged as a major issue in some areas, such as around Rome, with the city surrounded by a ring of insula, or essentially slum-level domiciles that crowded the landscape, swelling the city's population to nearly 1 million people, which would have been unheard of for that region and time. Indeed, even in the 17th century, philosophers and social scientists warned of a coming overpopulation crisis should the trajectory of human population growth continue, and even up into the 20th and even 21st centuries, many continued to beat the drums of the so-called population bomb. But is this really the case? Certainly in some areas of the world currently, yes, but in others, overpopulation is the least of their concerns. Just as it would be difficult for someone in New York City to imagine the region 5 centuries in the past, where nary but a handful of small tribes were scattered throughout the land, it's also difficult to imagine a reversal of this trend, with a shrinkage of human population. But this is actually occurring in many places around the world, and it's only projected to get more extreme in the next 100 years. Of course, if we're looking on a global scale, the human population is still growing, albeit at a much slower rate than projected in the past, most likely stagnating around 9 billion before retracting once more as birth rates fall across all regions. But an interesting trend in many countries today is what we call a rural exodus. Across the United States, you can already see this happening as many rural towns across the country are being drained, with some very extreme examples, such as Loving Country, Texas, whose population dropped to an all-time low of only 67 people in 2000, a population density lower than the state of Alaska, although there has been a reversal of this trend in recent years. Or you can look at Esmeralda County, Nevada, on the route between Reno and Las Vegas, with its population dropping from 9,000 in 1910 to less than 1,000 today, giving it the lowest population density in the entire contiguous United States and lower than any sovereign nation on planet Earth. In China, a much more drastic and alarming trend has emerged, with their rural population dropping from 800 million in 2000 to only 700 million today, which may not sound like a big problem, but this means that 100 million more Chinese people are being crammed into densely populated cities, giving rise to conurbations and megacities, the likes of which have never been seen on this planet. However, these are all in the same country and isn't normally what most people think of when they imagine depopulation. So let's look at a bona fide case of a nation being depopulated nearly overnight, relatively speaking. If you're not familiar with the history of the region, you may often ask yourself why the Irish are so vehemently opposed to identifying with the British or the English. They speak the same language, right? They're allies today and very heavily integrated, aren't they? Well, in the not-so-distant past, these two were at war, with Oliver Cromwell leading the British conquest of Ireland. During this short period of war in the 17th century, hundreds of thousands of Irish civilians were killed or died from starvation, but this wasn't the worst to come. The Irish potato famine, or Great Famine, in the 19th century was something the people in this corner of the globe hadn't seen since the medieval era, and it's estimated that hundreds of thousands of Irish, mainly in more western rural areas, starved to death, with 2 million more deserting the island, leading to the impressive Irish diaspora we see today in the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and even Latin America. In the 1840s, before the famine, 8 million people lived in Ireland, and compare this to only 20 million in England at the time, and it's clear that they weren't exactly far behind. In the 1940s, its population had dropped by 4 million, only 50% of the island's previous population, and today the combined population of both the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland is only 6.8 million, making it one of the only areas on the planet that has a lower population today than it had 200 years ago. Now, of course, everyone knows about the Holocaust, as there were over 8 million Jews in Europe before 1939, but today there are only 1 million left. But there were other extreme depopulations during the same era, with the first major transfer being the expulsion of nearly 200,000 ethnic Koreans from the island of Sakhalin in the far east of Russia to remote areas of Central Asia in the 1930s. And this is one of the reasons that the countries of Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and Kyrgyzstan have such high ethnic Korean populations, despite being rather far from the Korean peninsula. This was only the beginning for Stalin, as other mass depopulations took place during his rule, including deporting 200,000 Crimean Tatars to Central Asia overnight for alleged Nazi collaboration, about one-fifth of the population of Crimea. He also deported nearly 1 million combined Chechen, Dagestani, and Circassians from the Caucasus after World War II, about 60% of the region's population, and possibly the largest of all, which was actually not entirely under the Soviet domain, would be the deportation and migration of nearly 12 million ethnic Germans from Eastern Europe after World War II, some voluntarily and some not so much. It's estimated that 1 to 2 million people died under the forced deportations of the Soviet Union, and although many were eventually allowed to return to their homelands, it took much longer for others. Even East Germany experienced this population reduction, mainly due to emigration to West Germany before and after the fall of the Iron Curtain, as its population has dropped 30% from a high of 18 million in 1950 to only around 13 million today, excluding the Allied-controlled portion of Berlin. And this has become a huge problem in many rural areas of Eastern Germany today, with economic conditions being similar to the former Eastern Bloc countries like Poland or the Czech Republic, rather than the rest of Western Germany. Eastern Europe has also suffered from mass depopulation following the fall of the Soviet Union, with the combined population of the Baltic region dropping 25% since 1990, from 8 million to only 6 million today, with one of the main driving factors for emigration being ethnic minorities such as the Polish, Russians, and Ukrainians returning to their countries of origin, but a large number of Latvians and Lithuanians have also been steadily streaming into Western Europe, especially the United Kingdom. Other former Eastern Bloc countries have met similar demographic fates, with Ukraine dropping from 52 million people in 1990 to only 43 million people today if you include Crimea, with many ethnic Russians in Ukraine going to Russia, while most ethnic Ukrainian migrants go to Western European countries like Italy, Spain, or Portugal. In the same time frame, Bulgaria's population has dropped from 9 to 7 million, with most ethnic Bulgarians migrating to Western Europe, while Turkish Bulgarians go either to Western Europe or Turkey. Romania's population has dropped from 23 to 19 million, with many of the same destinations as these other Eastern European migrants. Eastern Europe is not the only location where this is happening, as you may recognize a little country called Syria, where in the first 5 years of the Syrian Civil War, 4 million people out of the country's population of 21 million at the time fled the country, including 80% of its Christian population, and the country has yet to fully recover demographically even to this day. However, some countries that are somewhat overlooked would be in the New World, with Guyana and Suriname being two interesting examples. Although not exactly depopulated, as its population has remained somewhat stable since the 1990s, albeit steadily decreasing, it's estimated that nearly 400,000 people of Guyanese descent from any ethnicity live outside the country, with the largest settlements being in New York City and Toronto, Canada. Over 400,000 people of Surinamese descent live outside of Suriname, compared to a population of only 580,000 left in Suriname, with this immigrant group being highly ethnically heterogeneous, with white, Indian, Javanese, Maroon, and multiracial immigrants in the Netherlands today, reflecting the extreme diversity of the country. Ironically, despite seeming to some to be a tropical paradise, most Caribbean countries have extremely high emigration rates, including the territory of Puerto Rico. In the early 2000s, for the first time ever, more people of Puerto Rican descent lived in the mainland United States rather than on the island itself. This trend has only accelerated since then, with the island's population draining from 3.8 million in the year 2000 to only around 3 million today, a drop of around 25% and comparable to some regions of Eastern Europe. The population of people of Puerto Rican descent in the mainland is now double what is in the territory, meaning without emigration, Puerto Rico's population should be somewhere around 9 million, or comparable to the U.S. state of Georgia, all crammed into an island a third the size of the Atlanta metropolitan area. This gives you a good idea as to why so many leave the territory, in addition to major economic troubles and natural disasters. Now, of course, we could also talk about extreme levels of brutality and massacres that have occurred throughout history, such as the reign of the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia with Pol Pot, wherein a quarter of the population, nearly 2 million people, were killed in only a few short years during his brutal reign, or the depopulation of Poland during World War II, wherein a majority of Polish Jews, as well as a huge chunk of Slavic Poles, were killed during the Holocaust, or the Mongol conquest of Eurasia, with a staggering number of civilians slaughtered throughout China, Eastern Europe, the Middle East, and especially Central Asia, where the bulk of the previous Indo-European population of the steppes was killed and or assimilated into the newly growing Turco-Mongol nations. But for this video, I mainly wanted to focus on mass emigration from a given region rather than genocides. What about for the future? Demographers have been predicting the future of certain populations for decades now, and some of them have actually been incredibly accurate. And judging by the precipitous drop in fertility, one of the regions of the Earth that's going to be hit the hardest with depopulation would be East Asia. According to the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluations, fertility rates are dropping so quickly across the board that the human race will stop growing between the years 2050 to 2070 at less than 10 billion before dipping to only 9 billion by the end of the century, a global drop of nearly 10%. Due to their infamously low fertility rates, Japan's population is predicted to drop from its high of 130 million people in 2010 to only 60 million in 2100, and I don't know if there's any robots that can help them get out of that one. South Korea's population is expected to drop from 55 million in 2030 to 27 million in 2100, an even more extreme drop of 50%, and China's population is expected to stagnate at around 1.4 billion by 2030, if it hasn't already, and then precipitously drop by 600 million people to less than 0.8 billion in 2100, which is utterly mind-blowing. 600 million less people in one country in only 70 years, not due to any plague or war or genocide, simply human beings not having children. Even Africa is expected to stop growing eventually, albeit at a much higher endpoint than any other region, expecting to basically top off at 3 billion by 2100. However, it's entirely possible that they would stop growing before then, judging by the fact that birth rates are beginning to drop in urban African areas much quicker than they thought they would. So, what do you think of the looming depopulation of humanity? Good thing? Bad thing? Do you even care? I suppose that's something our descendants will have to deal with, and who knows what the Earth will look like then. So please let me know your thoughts on the historic and modern and future depopulation of certain areas and how you think this will affect mankind. As always, this has been Mason. Thanks for watching, everyone, and I'll see you next time.